mid-1940s, when the war had finally loosened its grip on America and the country was trying to remember how to dream again, thousands of young men and women began drifting toward one glittering promise on the West Coast, Los Angeles. The city shimmered with opportunity, or at least the illusion of it. Palm trees lined the boulevards, movie posters hung like holy icons, and studio gates stood tall like the entrance to another world. For many, Hollywood wasn't just a place. It was salvation. It was reinvention. It was the idea that no matter how small your beginnings were, the camera could make you larger than life. Among those dreamers was a quiet, dark-haired young woman named Elizabeth Short. She wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. She didn't come from wealth or influence. She was just 22 years old, with soft features, pale skin, and a habit of wearing black dresses that made her stand out in crowded rooms. People would later say she had an old Hollywood look about her, like she belonged in a black and white film. But long before the world knew her name, she was simply Betty, a girl chasing something she could almost touch but never quite hold. Elizabeth's story didn't begin in California. She was born in 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, into a family that would soon learn how fragile stability could be. When she was still a child, her father disappeared. At first, it was believed he had died. His car was found abandoned on a bridge, and many assumed he had taken his own life during the crushing years of the Great Depression. But the truth was different. He had walked away. He left his wife and 5 daughters behind, forcing Elizabeth's mother to raise the children alone, struggling through financial hardship and emotional abandonment. For a young girl, that kind of loss leaves a mark. It shapes how you see the world. It teaches you that love can vanish without warning. Elizabeth grew up shy but imaginative. She loved movies. She would sit in dark theaters and watch glamorous actresses light up the screen, memorizing their expressions, their posture, the way they carried themselves. The cinema wasn't just entertainment to her, it was escape. On the screen, women could transform into stars. They could rise above their circumstances. They could be adored. And somewhere deep inside, Elizabeth began to believe that she could be one of them. But life didn't make it easy. She suffered from health problems as a teenager, including severe asthma and bronchitis. Doctors suggested she move to a warmer climate to help her breathing. So she began spending time in Florida and eventually in California, drawn not only by the weather, but by the proximity to Hollywood itself. Each move felt like a step closer to her dream, yet the path was never clear. She didn't have formal acting training. She didn't have powerful connections. What she had was hope, charm, and an unshakable belief that she belonged somewhere brighter than the life she had known. By the time she arrived in Los Angeles for good, the city was buzzing with post-war energy. Soldiers were returning home. The economy was shifting. Nightclubs were alive with music. Producers and directors searched for the next face that could capture the public's attention. Elizabeth drifted through this world like a shadow, attending parties, meeting men connected to the industry, telling people she wanted to be in pictures. Some described her as mysterious. Others called her naive. A few painted her as calculating, though there was little evidence she had the power to manipulate anyone. In truth, she seemed caught between fantasy and reality, performing confidence while privately battling uncertainty. She had a distinctive look that made people remember her. She often wore black clothing, styled her dark hair carefully, and used makeup to accentuate her features. Friends later recalled that she liked to tell stories about herself, about supposed roles she might land, about connections she claimed to have. It's possible that these stories were part aspiration, part defense mechanism. In a city where everyone was trying to be someone, sometimes you had to speak your future out loud just to survive the present. Despite her efforts, success remained out of reach. She never landed a significant acting role. There were no screen tests that launched her into stardom, no breakthrough auditions that changed her fate. Instead, she moved from place to place, staying with friends, acquaintances, sometimes romantic partners. Her relationships were often short-lived. She was known to date servicemen and men who seemed fascinated by her beauty and vulnerability. Some saw her as a damsel in distress. Others saw her as a dreamer, unwilling to face harsh truths. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. She wanted more from life than what she had been given. There is something haunting about ambition when it exists without protection. Los Angeles in the 1940s was glamorous, yes, but it could also be ruthless. Behind the bright studio lights were powerful men, secret parties, whispered scandals, and a hierarchy that outsiders rarely understood. For a young woman without a safety net, the line between opportunity and danger could blur quickly. Elizabeth was navigating a world that rewarded beauty, but often punished vulnerability. In the final months of her life, she seemed restless. She traveled between cities, spent time in San Diego, and returned again to Los Angeles. She spoke of plans, of possibilities. There was still that flicker of hope that something might finally happen, that one meeting could change everything. To the outside world, she was just another aspiring actress. To herself, she may have believed she was standing on the edge of transformation. It's important to remember this version of Elizabeth, the living, breathing young woman, because history has a cruel way of reducing people to the worst thing that ever happened to them. Before the headlines, before the nickname that would echo for decades, she was a daughter, a sister, a girl who once sat in a dark theater believing that the screen held her future. She laughed. She worried. She made mistakes. She trusted people she probably shouldn't have trusted. She dreamed in a city that specialized in selling dreams. And maybe that's what makes her story so powerful. It begins not with horror, but with hope. A small-town girl arrives in Los Angeles with nothing but ambition and a suitcase. She believes that the city of stars might make room for one more. She believes that reinvention is possible. She believes that her past, the abandonment, the instability, the struggle, does not have to define her. But as the days pass and the promise of Hollywood grows more distant, the shadows around her life grow longer. The parties feel different. The faces around her become harder to read. The dream that once glowed so brightly begins to flicker. And somewhere in the space between who she was and who she hoped to become, Elizabeth Short finds herself standing at a crossroads she never saw coming. She could not have known that the name she was born with would one day be replaced by a darker one. A name the media would create, a name that would live far longer than she ever did. She could not have known that her search for stardom would end not under studio lights, but under something far colder and far more unforgiving. At this point in her story, she is still alive, still reaching, still believing. The tragedy has not yet struck. The world has not yet turned her into a symbol. She is simply a young woman in Los Angeles, chasing a dream in a city that promises everything and guarantees nothing. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, Los Angeles woke up to what seemed like an ordinary winter day, calm and quiet, with a pale sun hanging over the neighborhoods and a light chill lingering in the air. But in a vacant lot in Leimert Park, something lay waiting that would shatter the illusion of safety in the city forever. It was just after 10 a.m. when a local resident, Betty Bursinger, was walking along Norton Avenue with her young daughter, pushing a stroller as she moved past the empty patch of land. At first glance, she noticed what looked like a store mannequin discarded in the grass, pale and oddly positioned, almost staged. In a city filled with storefront displays and movie props, the sight did not immediately register as danger, but something about it felt wrong. The shape was too human, too deliberate. As she stepped closer, her breath caught in her throat, and the world around her seemed to fall silent. What she was looking at was not a mannequin. It was the body of a young woman. The body had been severed cleanly at the waist, cut into two separate halves, and carefully placed a short distance apart. There was no visible blood at the scene. The skin appeared drained of color, almost unnaturally pale, as if life had been removed long before the body was left there. The arms were positioned above the head in a deliberate pose, and the legs were spread. It did not look chaotic. It did not look rushed. It looked arranged. And that detail, more than anything else, sent a chill through investigators and the public alike, because this was not simply a murder committed in a moment of rage. This felt methodical, controlled, intentional. Police from the Los Angeles Police Department quickly sealed off the area. Detectives arrived, along with photographers and curious onlookers who gathered at a distance, whispering and straining to see what had happened. Even in a city accustomed to scandal and crime, this was different. Officers noted that the body had been completely drained of blood, suggesting that the killing had taken place somewhere else and that the remains had been transported to the vacant lot afterward. The precision of the cuts led investigators to believe the killer had some knowledge of anatomy or surgical skill. This was not the work of an amateur. Then there was the face. The victim's mouth had been slashed from the corners toward the ears, creating a grotesque, exaggerated smile, often referred to as a Glasgow smile. It was a detail that seemed almost theatrical, as though the killer wanted to leave behind an image that would haunt anyone who looked at it. Yet despite the brutality of the injuries, the body itself appeared washed, clean. There were no signs of a struggle in the dirt, no tire tracks that clearly stood out, no obvious clues left behind. It was as if the killer had stepped out of the shadows, completed a grim task elsewhere, and then carefully staged the scene before disappearing again without a trace. As word spread through the neighborhood, fear spread with it. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Doors were locked. Conversations turned hushed and urgent. Who could do something like this? And more terrifyingly, could they do it again? The body was soon identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, a young woman who had been reported missing only days earlier. For those who had known her, the shock was unbearable. For the rest of the city, she became the center of a rapidly unfolding nightmare. The crime scene photographs, stark and clinical, would later become some of the most infamous images in American criminal history. Detectives combed the area for evidence, measuring distances, documenting positions, searching for fibers, footprints, anything that might point to a suspect. But the scene offered very little. The killer had taken time. The killer had planned. The killer had made sure that the lot in Leimert Park was not the place of death, but merely the place of discovery. That distinction mattered, because it meant there was another location out there, somewhere in Los Angeles, where the true horror had occurred. The autopsy would reveal further disturbing details. Elizabeth had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, which investigators believed had rendered her unconscious before the fatal cuts were made. The dissection itself appeared precise, performed along natural lines of the body, reinforcing the theory that the person responsible possessed at least some medical training. There were no clear defensive wounds indicating a prolonged fight, which raised even more questions about how she had ended up in the killer's control. Had she known her attacker? Had she trusted him? Or had she been taken by force, overwhelmed before she even had a chance to react? As the investigation unfolded, the press began to circle like vultures. Reporters pushed against police lines, demanding statements, hungry for details that would captivate readers across the country. Los Angeles was a city built on spectacle, and now it had been handed a real-life horror story more shocking than anything Hollywood could script. Within hours, the discovery of Elizabeth's body was front-page news. The brutality of the crime was described in lurid detail, and the public's fascination grew with each passing day. The vacant lot in Leimert Park transformed from an ordinary piece of land into a symbol of fear, a place forever marked by what had been found there that morning. Investigators faced enormous pressure. Leads poured in from across the city. Tips, rumors, accusations. Some claimed to have seen Elizabeth in the days before her death. Others insisted they knew men who were capable of such violence. The police questioned friends, acquaintances, former romantic partners, anyone who might have crossed her path. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, one unsettling truth became clear. The killer had vanished as cleanly as he had worked. What disturbed people most was not only the violence, but the sense of message. The body had not been hidden, it had been displayed. Left in a residential neighborhood where it would almost certainly be discovered quickly. The positioning, the calculated mutilation, the absence of blood at the scene, all of it suggested intention beyond murder. It felt like a performance, a statement, a challenge to the authorities. And that possibility ignited a deeper fear in Los Angeles, because it meant the person responsible might not simply be a criminal hiding in fear of capture, but someone who wanted attention, who wanted the city to see what he had done. In the days following the discovery, the image of that vacant lot lingered in the minds of residents. Even those who had not seen the scene firsthand imagined it vividly, shaped by newspaper descriptions and whispered retellings. The sun rising over the quiet street, the child in the stroller, the mother stepping closer, the realization dawning in horror. It felt almost cinematic, except this was no movie set. There were no retakes, no director calling cut. Only the cold reality that a young woman's life had ended in a way so calculated and so cruel that it would define Los Angeles for decades to come. That January morning did more than uncover a body. It exposed the dark underbelly of a city that prided itself on glamour and reinvention. It forced residents to confront the idea that beneath the bright lights and palm trees, something far more sinister could be hiding. And as detectives continued their search for answers, one thing was certain. Whoever had left Elizabeth Short in that vacant lot had not just committed a crime, they had ignited a mystery that would refuse to die, a shadow that would stretch across generations, beginning with the silence of a pale winter morning and the terrible discovery that turned an empty patch of grass into the most infamous crime scene in Los Angeles history. In the days after Elizabeth Short's body was discovered, the investigation was no longer confined to detectives and crime labs. It exploded into the public arena, fueled by headlines, speculation, and a city that could not look away. Los Angeles was already a place where illusion and reality blurred together, but now that blur felt dangerous. The murder was shocking on its own, yet what transformed it into a cultural phenomenon was the way the media seized it, shaped it, and in many ways, amplified it beyond the control of law enforcement. Newspapers competed fiercely for details, racing each other to print new revelations, rumors, and dramatic interpretations of who Elizabeth had been and what might have led to her death. Among them, Los Angeles Times played a central role, publishing front-page stories that both informed and inflamed public curiosity. It was during this frenzy that a nickname emerged, one that would eclipse her real name in the public consciousness. Inspired partly by the recent noir film The Blue Dahlia, reporters coined the term Black Dahlia. The name was cinematic, mysterious, almost poetic in its darkness. It fit the era's fascination with crime stories that felt like film plots come to life. But in giving Elizabeth that name, the media also began reshaping her identity. She was no longer simply a young woman from Massachusetts trying to find her way in Hollywood. She became a character, an enigma wrapped in shadows, a figure of intrigue whose life was dissected almost as thoroughly as her body had been. Reporters dug into her past with relentless intensity. They interviewed acquaintances, former roommates, casual friends, men she had dated. Every anecdote, no matter how small or unreliable, was treated as potential evidence of hidden secrets. Some described her as sweet and soft-spoken. Others claimed she enjoyed attention and told embellished stories about her ambitions. The press, hungry for drama, often emphasized the more sensational interpretations. They painted her as a mysterious drifter, a woman moving between men, chasing stardom through uncertain means. In doing so, they blurred the line between fact and narrative, crafting an image that sold newspapers, but may not have reflected the full truth of who she was. This media storm had consequences. Tips flooded into police stations, many of them contradictory or clearly fabricated. People claimed to have seen Elizabeth in the days before her death in various locations across the city. Some insisted they had crucial information about secret parties or shadowy figures. Others wrote letters confessing to the crime, only to later admit they were seeking attention. The sheer volume of incoming information overwhelmed investigators, forcing them to sift through mountains of speculation while trying to focus on tangible evidence. Then, something chilling happened. A package arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. Inside were personal items belonging to Elizabeth Short, her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book. The items had been carefully cleaned with gasoline to remove fingerprints. Accompanying them was a note assembled from letters cut out of magazines, spelling out a taunting message. The writer signed it, Black Dahlia Avenger. It was as if the killer had stepped forward, not to surrender, but to play a game. The act confirmed what many had already suspected. This was someone who craved attention, someone who understood the power of the press and wanted to manipulate it. The letter electrified the city. Now the case was not just about solving a murder. It was about a direct challenge to the authorities. Detectives examined the package meticulously, searching for trace evidence, handwriting clues, anything that might reveal the sender's identity. Yet once again, the trail went cold. The gasoline had done its job. No usable fingerprints were recovered. The address book inside the package became a new focal point for investigators, leading them to question dozens more individuals whose names appeared in its pages. Each name represented a potential suspect, a possible link to the killer, but none provided the breakthrough detectives desperately needed. As weeks turned into months, the media coverage did not fade. It intensified. Radio broadcasts discussed new theories nightly. National newspapers picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of post-war anxiety. The idea that such a calculated, brutal crime could occur in a city of sunshine and glamour unsettled people far beyond California. Hollywood itself felt the impact. Actors and actresses whispered about the case on studio lots. Some feared that the city's darker side was being exposed to the world. Others worried that the killer might be someone hidden within their own social circles. Speculation grew more elaborate. Some theories suggested that Elizabeth had stumbled into a world of secret parties attended by powerful men. Others proposed that she had been involved in a love triangle that turned deadly. There were whispers of organized crime, of doctors with surgical expertise, of individuals who moved comfortably between wealth and secrecy. Each new theory fed the public imagination, but few were supported by solid evidence. The lack of clear answers created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed myth, rumor, and paranoia. For the police, the intense scrutiny was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the publicity kept the case alive, encouraging witnesses to come forward. On the other, it created enormous pressure to deliver results quickly. Detectives were criticized for perceived missteps. Some accused the department of leaking information to favored reporters. Others claimed that valuable leads were being overlooked in the rush to manage public perception. Behind closed doors, investigators wrestled with frustration. They had a victim whose life had been dissected in the press, and a killer who seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. The nickname Black Dahlia became inseparable from the case. It appeared in bold headlines, in whispered conversations, in the fearful imaginations of residents locking their doors at night. It transformed Elizabeth into a symbol of something larger, the collision between Hollywood fantasy and real-world brutality. The name carried a kind of dark elegance, which only deepened the tragedy. It was as if the media had wrapped the horror in a noir aesthetic, turning a human life into a narrative that felt almost scripted. Yet beneath the sensationalism lay a stark reality. A young woman had been murdered, and no one knew by whom. As time passed, the initial shock gave way to uneasy fascination. The city learned to live with the mystery, but it never truly moved on. Every new development, every rumored confession, reignited the fire. People debated the case at dinner tables and in barbershops. Amateur sleuths emerged, convinced they could see connections the police had missed. The story refused to fade because it had been etched so deeply into the cultural psyche. What made this phase of the case so powerful was not just the brutality of the crime, but the way it became a spectacle. The media did not simply report the story. It shaped it, dramatized it, and in some ways, immortalized it. Elizabeth Short's death became intertwined with the identity of Los Angeles itself, a city of bright lights casting long shadows. And as the investigation continued without a clear resolution, one haunting truth settled over the city. Somewhere out there, the person who had sent that taunting letter, who had staged that chilling scene, was watching the headlines, listening to the broadcasts, and perhaps even smiling at the chaos they had created. As the headlines continued, and the public fascination refused to fade, the investigation quietly shifted into a more complicated and frustrating phase, one defined not by shocking discoveries, but by endless interviews, mounting files, and a growing list of suspects that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department worked around the clock, chasing leads that arrived by the hundreds. By some estimates, more than 150 individuals were seriously questioned in connection with the murder of Elizabeth Short. Each name carried the possibility of a breakthrough. Each interrogation carried the hope that the mystery would finally unravel. Yet with every promising lead came another dead end. Some suspects were men Elizabeth had known personally, former romantic interests, acquaintances she had met at parties, individuals who had offered her a place to stay during her drifting months in California. Detectives retraced her final known movements, attempting to reconstruct her last days hour by hour. Where had she been seen? Who had she spoken to? Who had the opportunity to harm her? Witness accounts were inconsistent. Memories shifted under pressure. What had seemed clear at first began to blur as time passed and stories changed. Other suspects emerged from outside her immediate circle. Anonymous tips pointed to doctors, surgeons, and medical students, fueled by the belief that the precise dissection of her body required anatomical expertise. The theory was compelling. The clean separation at the waist, the careful drainage of blood, the apparent knowledge of how to minimize visible evidence. These details suggested skill rather than chaos. Detectives quietly investigated individuals with surgical backgrounds, looking for any connection to Elizabeth or any sign of violent tendencies. Among the most talked-about names was George Hoddle, a well-connected physician whose later notoriety would fuel decades of speculation. At the time, however, suspicion was built more on circumstantial patterns than concrete proof. Hoddle was intelligent, charismatic, and moved comfortably within elite social circles. He had medical training, which aligned with theories about the killer's possible expertise. Years after the murder, allegations would surface from within his own family, including claims made by his son that he believed his father was responsible. But during the original investigation, nothing solid tied him definitively to the crime. Police surveillance of Hoddle in later years would reveal troubling statements and questionable behavior, yet even those recordings stopped short of clear confession. The evidence never crossed the line from suspicion to certainty. And in a case under such intense scrutiny, suspicion alone was not enough. Beyond doctors, investigators examined former servicemen who had returned from World War II, some of whom struggled with trauma and instability. They looked at drifters, small-time criminals, and even individuals already incarcerated for other violent acts. Confessions arrived from across the country. Some were clearly false from the beginning, written by individuals craving attention. Others required careful verification before being dismissed. The police faced a painful paradox. The more famous the case became, the more noise it generated, and within that noise, it became increasingly difficult to hear the truth. Complicating matters further was the state of forensic science. In 1947, there was no DNA analysis. Fingerprint technology existed, but only if usable prints were left behind. The killer had been meticulous. The body had been washed. Personal items mailed to newspapers had been cleaned with gasoline. The crime scene itself offered little physical evidence to anchor the investigation. Detectives relied heavily on interviews, alibis, timelines, and intuition. They built psychological profiles long before modern profiling techniques were formally established. They tried to imagine the kind of mind capable of such calculated brutality. Was this someone driven by personal rage against Elizabeth, or someone who selected her as a target of opportunity? Was the staging meant as revenge, ritual, or pure theatrical display? As months turned into a year, public frustration grew. Editorials criticized the police for failing to produce an arrest. Rumors circulated that powerful individuals were being protected, that corruption within the city's elite was shielding the real killer. Los Angeles in the late 1940s was a complex web of politics, organized crime, Hollywood influence, and shifting loyalties. The possibility that the murderer might be someone with connections unsettled both citizens and investigators. Whether or not those suspicions were justified, they added another layer of tension to an already volatile case. Detectives followed promising threads that seemed ready to break open the mystery, only to watch them unravel. One suspect reportedly passed a lie detector test, though polygraphs were far from definitive. Another confessed in detail but later recanted, and his account failed to match known facts. At times, investigators believed they were inches away from solving the crime. At other times, the case felt like a maze with no exit. The files grew thicker. The evidence boards became cluttered with photographs, maps, and handwritten notes connecting names with red lines that ultimately led to nothing. Behind the scenes, the emotional toll on investigators was significant. They were not just solving a puzzle, they were confronting the image of a young woman whose life had been violently cut short. The brutality of the crime lingered in their minds. Every time they reviewed photographs or autopsy reports, they were reminded of the stakes. This was not simply a high-profile case. It was a human tragedy demanding justice. Yet justice remained elusive. By the early 1950s, the case began to cool. Not because it was forgotten, but because active leads had dwindled. The media spotlight, once blinding, gradually shifted to other stories. New crimes emerged. New scandals captured attention. The Black Dahlia investigation remained open, but the urgency softened into a quiet persistence. Detectives were reassigned. Files were archived. Occasional new tips would resurface, sparking brief moments of renewed activity, but none delivered the definitive answer the city longed for. The unsolved nature of the case created a vacuum that speculation eagerly filled. Over the decades, authors, journalists, and amateur sleuths revisited the evidence, proposing new suspects and re-examining old ones. Some theories accused prominent figures. Others suggested elaborate conspiracies involving multiple perpetrators. Yet despite the passage of time and the advancement of investigative techniques, no one was ever formally charged with Elizabeth Short's murder. The official record remained unchanged. The case was unsolved. What makes this chapter of the story so haunting is not only the brutality of the crime, but the silence that followed. A killer walked free. Whether he blended seamlessly back into society or lived with the constant fear of exposure, no one can say for certain. The absence of resolution became part of the legend. In many ways, the failure to identify and convict a suspect deepened the mystery, transforming the case from a tragic homicide into a cultural enigma. For the detectives who devoted years of their careers to the investigation, the lack of closure was a heavy burden. For the public, it was a source of unease. If such a calculated crime could be committed without consequence, what did that say about the safety of the city? And for Elizabeth Short, whose dreams had brought her to Los Angeles in search of something brighter, the unanswered questions became her final legacy. The investigation into her murder stands as a testament to both the dedication and the limitations of law enforcement in an era before modern forensic breakthroughs. It is a story of relentless pursuit and repeated frustration, of suspects who almost fit but never quite, of clues that shimmered briefly before dissolving into doubt. And at its core, it is a reminder that sometimes the most chilling part of a crime is not the act itself, but the silence that follows when the truth refuses to reveal itself. More than 7 decades have passed since the winter morning when Elizabeth Short's body was discovered, yet the case refuses to fade into the background of history. Time has a way of softening most tragedies, filing them neatly into textbooks and archives. But this one lingers. It resurfaces in documentaries, in late-night discussions, in podcasts dissecting every angle, and in books that promise to finally reveal the truth. The name Black Dahlia has outlived the era in which it was created, becoming one of the most enduring mysteries in American crime history. And the reason it endures is not only because of the brutality of the murder, but because of what it represents: a collision between ambition, media spectacle, and the darker side of a city built on illusion. Los Angeles has changed dramatically since 1947. The skyline has grown taller. The film industry has evolved. Entire neighborhoods have transformed. Yet the vacant lot in Leimert Park remains a symbolic landmark in the story of the city's hidden shadows. It is no longer an empty patch of dirt as it was that morning, but the memory of what happened there still clings to the narrative of Los Angeles. In a place that sells fantasy to the world, the Black Dahlia case stands as a reminder that not all stories have scripted endings. Part of what keeps the case alive is the absence of certainty. Humans are wired to seek closure. We want answers. We want villains identified and punished. We want mysteries resolved so we can neatly categorize them and move on. But in the murder of Elizabeth Short, there was no arrest, no trial, no courtroom confession. There was only speculation layered upon speculation, generation after generation, attempting to solve what the original investigators could not. The lack of resolution transforms the case into an open door, one that invites anyone to step inside and try to piece together the puzzle. Over the decades, numerous suspects have been revisited and re-examined. Among the most debated remains George Hoddle, whose name resurfaced years later through claims made by his son, a former detective who became convinced that his father had committed the crime. Recordings from police surveillance, old photographs, personal letters, all have been scrutinized in search of hidden meaning. Yet even with modern technology and fresh eyes, definitive proof remains elusive. Every theory has its supporters and its critics. Each new claim sparks headlines, then slowly settles back into uncertainty. The case has also embedded itself deeply into popular culture. Films, novels, and television series have drawn inspiration from the Black Dahlia story, sometimes closely following known facts, other times weaving fiction into the framework of reality. The noir aesthetic of 1940s Los Angeles, shadowy alleyways, smoky nightclubs, morally ambiguous characters, fits seamlessly with the details of Elizabeth's life and death. In many ways, the case feels like it was born from a screenplay, yet its authenticity makes it far more unsettling. This was not entertainment, it was real. A real young woman with dreams, flaws, and aspirations became immortalized not for her life, but for her death. There is also a psychological dimension to why this case endures. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition and vulnerability. Elizabeth came to Los Angeles seeking opportunity, drawn by the same promise that has lured countless others before and after her. Her story mirrors the dreams of thousands who arrive in big cities hoping for transformation. That her journey ended so violently creates a stark contrast between hope and horror. The city that symbolized possibility became the setting of her destruction. That contradiction lingers in the collective imagination. Another reason the mystery refuses to die is the chilling suggestion that the killer may have blended back into ordinary life. There was no dramatic shootout, no last-minute capture. If the murderer was never identified, then he could have continued walking the same streets, attending the same social gatherings, living outwardly normal while carrying a secret that defined one of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century. That possibility unsettles people even today. It challenges our belief in justice and order. It suggests that sometimes the truth can slip through the cracks and remain hidden indefinitely. Advancements in forensic science have reignited hope at various points. DNA analysis, digital reconstruction, and modern profiling techniques have led some to believe that the case could still be solved. Old evidence has been re-examined. Archives have been reopened. Yet the passage of time presents its own obstacle. Witnesses have passed away. Physical evidence may have degraded or been lost. Memories that once held potential clues have faded into silence. The window for definitive answers grows narrower with each passing year. Despite this, the Black Dahlia case continues to attract new investigators, journalists, historians, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts determined to uncover what was missed. Online forums dissect every detail. Timelines are reconstructed repeatedly. Photographs are analyzed pixel by pixel. In an age of information, the mystery feels both closer and more distant at the same time. We have more tools than ever before, yet the core question remains unanswered. Who killed Elizabeth Short? There is something haunting about the idea that her identity was overshadowed by a nickname. Black Dahlia sounds dramatic, almost poetic, but it distances us from the human being behind the headline. Elizabeth was more than a symbol. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman navigating a complicated world. Remembering her as a person rather than a legend changes the tone of the story. It shifts the focus from spectacle to empathy. And perhaps that is the most important part of why this case still matters. It reminds us that behind every unsolved mystery is a life interrupted. In the end, the Black Dahlia case stands as a paradox. It is one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history, yet it offers no definitive conclusion. It is endlessly discussed, yet fundamentally silent. It reveals as much about society's fascination with crime as it does about the crime itself. The media frenzy, the speculation, the decades of debate, all of it reflects our desire to impose order on chaos. But sometimes chaos resists. As long as there are questions without answers, this story will continue to be told. It will be revisited by new generations who see in it a puzzle waiting to be solved. And perhaps that is why it has endured for so long, not because of the horror alone, but because of the uncertainty. The unresolved nature of the case leaves space for imagination, for investigation, for doubt. It leaves us staring into a shadow that refuses to take clear shape. Somewhere in the vast history of Los Angeles, beneath the glamour and the ever-changing skyline, this story remains embedded like a scar. A young woman arrived with dreams. She became a headline. She became a legend. And in the silence left behind by unanswered questions, the mystery of the Black Dahlia continues to echo, reminding us that not every story, no matter how deeply we examine it, is guaranteed an ending.